stop killing the dead. They're mine. If you don't want the dead,
For millennia, the dark creature, the terrifying Grim Reaper, has haunted human imagination and served as a symbol of the fact that death is one of life's unavoidable realities. From ancient mythology to contemporary stories, this famous figure of death appears in a variety of forms across cultures, but always with the same job description: to guide souls to the afterlife. Though we usually see the Reaper as a shrouded skeleton with a scythe, it takes numerous forms, from the Aztec deity Mictlantecuhtli, ruler of the underworld, to the Nordic Valkyries leading slain soldiers to Valhalla. Cultural differences aside, all of these share a common theme: the inevitable end of life. And with it comes terror, intrigue, and, at times, an odd calmness in the face of uncertainty. As long as there is life, there's death, and with it the Reaper knocking on doors to claim souls. It seems they will never go out of style. And so, in this video, we are going to explore the eerie but intriguing history of the Reapers, robes, scythe, and all. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Origins of the Grim Reaper, the first Reapers of Death. Though its actual roots are far earlier and drawn from tales and beliefs that personify death in varied, interesting ways, the Grim Reaper is a horrific creature of medieval origin. A story from the late 13th century about the 3 living and the 3 dead is one of the early depictions of skeletal figures representing death. 3 guys on a hunting trip come upon 3 skeletal beings who teach them about life's value and its fleeting nature. However, death was not alien to ancient societies. Rather, they witnessed it up close, just as we do, and molded gods and spirits to make sense of all of it. Nevertheless, their conceptions of death were more complex, with figures who did not frighten, but rather guided souls from this world to the next. In ancient Greece, though far from frightening, Thanatos was death personified. His image was one of compassion and gentleness, which represented the finality of death rather than terror around it. Twin brother of Hypnos, the god of sleep, and a son of Nyx, the god of night, Thanatos reflected a sort of calm finality, an inevitable end devoid of terror and punishment. Greek art occasionally represented him as a young man with wings, lulling a dozing figure softly down into Hades. Instead of being an aggressive soul collector, Thanatos was more of a melancholy escort. His very presence conveyed a serene acceptance of death as a necessary component of life rather than of something to be feared. The Romans had their own agent of death named Mors, who was similar to Greek's Thanatos but had a darker edge. Mors mirrored the Romans' attitude towards death, which was a reminder of the certainty of death. He was no malevolent force ready to pounce. Then there was Charon, the Greek ferryman who was a touch grimmer, but served more as a guide than a gloomy ghost. His job was to ferry souls, of course in exchange for a coin as a fee, across the river Styx to Hades. Souls couldn't cross without Charon's help, hence he was an important figure in Greek ideas about the next world. However, he was not an executioner, but merely an integral cog in the wheel of fate. No scythe, no sinister robe, simply a ferry ride. The Celts had a fascinating perspective on death. Death was not a single character, but was portrayed as a group of supernatural beings or spirits, such as the Morrigan, a goddess linked to fate who would occasionally take on the form of a crow or raven to signify the impending doom of death. Morrigan was not a reaper of lives, but a symbol of fate and warned of death. She would occasionally visit battlefields and foretell bloodshed. The Celts saw death less as an ominous figure prowling in the darkness, demanding life, and more as an inevitable part of destiny. Another role for other Celtic spirits was to serve as guides or middlemen, helping people make the transition from one life to the next. Norse mythology has a more feminine take on the idea of death. On winged horses, the Valkyries, the ferocious and beautiful warrior women rode over battlefields, handpicking the most courageous heroes to die and then guiding them directly to Valhalla, Odin's great hall. There, these selected fighters awaited Ragnarok, the last great battle meant to destroy the planet. Acting as Odin's messenger, the Valkyries bridge the gap between life and death in a way that seems shockingly like the angels of Judeo-Christian beliefs. Angels, too, are known to convey divine messages, provide protection, and even accompany the dead to their final resting place. In many cultures, the archangels Michael and Gabriel play the role of the angel of death. In Islam, however, there is a spirit called Azrael, who said to have 4,000 wings and a body with as many eyes and tongues as there are people alive, and holds a scroll that has the fate of the mortals. However, not all deaths are painless. Greek mythology gives us Ceres, sisters of Thanatos, who forcefully extract the souls from the bodies of those severely injured. And then there's Hel, the Norse goddess ruling Helheim, the cold underworld of the dead. In Celtic mythology, the Anku is a ghostly creature from the Breton tradition. He is described as a towering, gloomy figure with either long white hair or a spinning head, and he is said to be the one who drives a cart piled with the dead. One stop at a house, and you know your time in this world is up. These frightening figures across civilizations depict the several faces of death, some offering serenity, others terror, yet all mark the end of life. But with time, these many representations of death began to change into something darker and more unambiguous. Because of the widespread terror felt during times of conflict, starvation, and the Black Death, fear changed the picture of death from a guide to a reaper. Death was no longer viewed as a reassuring companion or solemn remainder. Rather, it transformed into an all-consuming, unstoppable power that people could name, see, and even fear. Death became a picture of sheer inevitability formed by fear and despair that takes lives regardless of our age, social standing, or moral character. This resulted in the birth of the Grim Reaper as we know it. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Grim Reaper had transformed from an abstract concept and guide to a harbinger of death. Though the road to death had been paved by ancient death guides like Thanatos and Charon, the coming of the Reaper transformed death into something tangible and forever unforgettable, bringing to mind the fact that death is ever present, constantly waiting, and inevitable. Inspired by these legends of medieval horror, the society painted a picture of death that was merciless and uncompromising. The Grim Reaper evolved from simply a religious warning to a haunting symbol of the sufferings of the times. A gloomy creature that once imagined lingered in the minds of the people, bearing the weight of the tragic time. And this image stuck, and how. The picture took hold and never let go, a vision that has echoed through art, literature, and even pop culture long after the plague faded from Europe's shores.
Ted! It's the Grim Reaper, dude! Oh.
The medieval era and the birth of the modern Grim Reaper. The personified notion of death has been around since the dawn of time. It brought the word Grim Reaper with it. For most, if not all of us, just the words Grim Reaper paints a certain mental picture, usually a skeletal figure, the Grim Reaper, covered in a dark, hooded robe, carried a scythe to reap the souls of the living. But why the skeletal figure? And why the robe? Why the scythe? And when and how did the image become connected to death and mortality? The Grim Reaper, as we know it, was born during the darkest days of the 14th century, as the Black Death spread through Europe, claiming the lives of millions and destroying entire towns. Death was no longer just an abstract idea, but a concrete reality that people lived every day during the plague, claiming the lives of about 25 million people during this time, or perhaps more. Death was everywhere. Given its rapid spread and the increasing death toll, many in medieval times thought the plague was a punishment from God. People needed a means to understand such incomprehensible loss, and the Grim Reaper provided one, serving as a somber reminder of mortality in a culture that confronted it every day. The Grim Reaper became a symbol of gloom and doom, representing the fear of the time. Draped in darkness, the black robe of the Reaper is reminiscent of monks and mourners, a cloak of loss and mystery that hid all signs of life. As for the choice of weapon, the scythe was a tool of harvest rather than only a weapon, representing the Reaper as a soul harvester who never stops. Following one of the most devastating pandemics human history has ever seen, the entire continent was consumed by fear. Fear of dying, fear of the unknown disease, and fear of the pain that came with it. A general sense of gloomy sadness seeped through everything and impacted artists and writers of the time. In this setting of death and hopelessness, pictures of a skeleton figure surfaced. It went beyond mere symbolism. By portraying the Grim Reaper as a skeletal or ghostly apparition, medieval art and literature embraced the idea that death is cold, impersonal, and unavoidable. These depictions highlighted how death is a fact of life for all people, no matter how rich or important they are. Paintings, manuscripts, and carvings all started to feature the danse macabre, that is, the dance of death, which became common in religious art. These pieces of art displayed skeletal figures leading a procession of mortals, kings, merchants, children, priests, and peasants, as they danced their way to death. The lesson was clear and direct. Death will come for all, regardless of one's social stature, religious beliefs, or riches. Everyone stood on the same ground in front of death, and the danse macabre became a visual mantra that conveyed that message. It showed a gruesome spectacle where the Grim Reapers would call upon dead spirits to dance along their graves. Popular figures chosen were a pope, an emperor, a king, a child, and a laborer, to remind us that every mortal was equal in front of death. It was also used to highlight the folly of the human race who placed earthly possessions in such high regard. This depressing tone was further emphasized in literary works and religious books. The notion memento mori, or remember you must die, became a universal perspective, as several religious sermons discussed life as a fleeting, fragile experience, always heading ultimately to judgment. The presence of the Reaper throughout art and literature captured the era's constant reminder of impermanence. No mortal life was permanent. The Grim Reaper in various cultures. Death is universal. Closely linked to our ideas of death is the figure of the Angel of Death. Different cultures and religions call the Angel of Death by different names. Azrael in Islamic theology, Michael, Gabriel, Samael, and Sariel in Judeo-Christian tradition, Maria in Zoroastrianism, Mut in Babylon mythology, the 14 Angels of Death, Malak HaMavet, Yetzirah, Yahudaim, and others in rabbinical texts, and Suriel in Falasha tradition. There are numerous ways that people all over the world have imagined death and the hereafter, but the Western figure of the Grim Reaper, characterized by its dark robe and scythe, is perhaps the most recognizable image of death. However, it is far from the only one. Cultures around the globe have created distinctive figures to represent the concept of death as a reflection of their cultural views and attitudes toward death. Angel of Death has existed as a part of folklore for ages. We have already talked about the Greek Thanatos and the Norse Valkyries. Then, in Mexico, Santa Muerte perhaps offers one of the most vibrant and unique iterations of death. Unlike the dark and gloomy picture we have of the Grim Reaper, known as the Holy Death, Santa Muerte is a skeletal saint often draped in bright, colorful robes and adorned ground with flowers. She represents both death and protection, a dual role that makes her a beloved figure among her followers. She's become a saint for the marginalized, embodying not just death but hope, especially for those who feel forgotten by other institutions. Santa Muerte is a protector, guide, and even provider, which makes her different from the Western Grim Reaper who has a single-minded duty of reaping souls. People come to her for comfort, blessings, and even miracles, thus making her a protector rather than a mere end. A character closely associated with judgment and the hereafter, Yama is the Lord of Death and Justice in Hinduism. Yama, often depicted as a dark-skinned deity riding a buffalo and holding a lasso, doesn't merely collect souls. He oversees their journey to the afterlife and guides it towards reincarnation or not. Yama is a figure of accountability, reminding people that their actions in life have consequences beyond death. Unlike the Western Reaper, Yama's presence isn't meant to terrify. He's a reminder that one's actions carry weight beyond the physical world, a gatekeeper who reminds followers of their responsibilities in life. His role embodies the Hindu belief in samsara, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, where death isn't a final destination, but a checkpoint in a long spiritual journey. Islam has an intriguing interpretation of the Reaper through Azrael, the angel of death. Azrael plays an important position in Islamic tradition, and not because he inspires dread, but because he acts as a link between this world and the next. According to Islamic traditions, Azrael keeps a ledger of every person's life and death and makes sure that every soul is claimed at the right moment. When Azrael shows up, he does so with reverence, treating each soul with respect as it leaves the world of the living to go to the place where God judges the world. It is not Azrael's job to hunt souls. He is a messenger and an obedient worker. In Islamic teachings, his presence gives death a comforting structure by showing it as a planned step on a trip. This makes Azrael more of a caretaker than a grim collector. Santa Muerte, Yama, and Azrael are all examples of different ways that people around the world have thought about death. People in the West usually think of the Reaper as a faceless, impartial collector who brings people to their deaths. But these other figures show that death is a process with help, direction, and a divine plan. It can be a guide, a judge, or even a comfort. Each version is useful and depends on how the culture sees life and what comes after. It has never been shown that the Reaper actually kills someone with the evil intention of harvesting souls. His only job is to accompany and guide the souls of the dead to the afterlife, which isn't always hell. Well, I'd like to believe that, but in my opinion, it's really nice of him to walk us there, because what if we had to do it by ourselves? Somehow I feel bad for the Grim Reaper, because when someone dies, they see their whole life, all of their goals and dreams, crumble and turn to dust, while people who are still alive have a bad opinion of the Reaper, but people who have died may have a completely different opinion and might see him as their guide to the next. The Reaper that we think is dark and evil may be a friend to them. Consider the predicament of the Reaper himself, existing between worlds and not hurting anyone, only to be feared and judged by humans who call him wicked. The story of the Angel of Death or the Grim Reaper goes back thousands of years. Is it too much of a stretch to think that the Reaper is an old soul who is used to the afterlife and the shift and has been sent to help the new souls? Would it also be unreasonable to think that he might care about the dead because he has seen and felt pain, judgment, and hurt in his own life and in the lives of others? Well, don't mind me. I'm just thinking out loud. Evolution of the Grim Reaper in modern pop culture. Over the last decades, the Grim Reaper has come out of myths and tales to become a well-known character in books, movies, comics, and even comedy, representing everything from comedic relief to fear. This masked figure has been portrayed many times, sometimes as a scary sign of death, and other times as a figure that is portrayed as a misunderstood, almost relatable character that reflects society's struggle with death. The Reaper isn't just the scary end of the world anymore. It's a figure with layers who can be scary, relatable, or even humorous at times. Each portrayal shows a different aspect of how people deal with death, providing new insights into a character who previously plagued their nightmares. Ingmar Bergman's 1957 movie The Seventh Seal has one of the most famous early portrayals of the Reaper. Death is not a violent destroyer in this movie. Instead, it is a spiritual force that is calm and thoughtful and plays a game of chess with a knight. The Reaper in this film is smart, careful, and even a little patient, if I may say so, which reflects the post-war existential dread of the age after World War II. Bergman's version of the Reaper isn't just a bad guy, but also a psychological question that makes you think about the meaning of life and how trivial it is. Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, published later in the 20th and 21st centuries, is a hilarious take on the Grim Reaper. That version of the Reaper isn't scary. Instead, he's shown as a worn-out office worker who's sick of life's unpredictable nature and is always on call to do work that never stops. Death turns into a snarky, deadpan figure, almost sardonic, resigned to its job of accompanying souls on their journey. This humanizes the Reaper, which makes death seem more relatable and reminds us of our own mundane routines. It almost makes us think of death not as something bad, but as something that will happen, and we don't always have to be afraid of it. It has a sense of humor that, strangely enough, makes death feel a little less lonely. Television has also had its own take on the Reaper. The long-running series Supernatural represents the idea of Reapers as a group, not a single person, with each Reaper having a unique personality. Different Reapers show up throughout the show, some being obedient and others nearly empathetic, illustrating that death is not a one-size-fits-all experience. Among the most remarkable Reapers in the program, Billy develops into a layered character, at first terrifying but finally likable, showing both duty and compassion. Supernatural shows death through different Reapers, which gives viewers the impression that death isn't always cruel. It's just a purpose-driven process to guide the souls, rather than a cruel act. When it comes to horror, the Reaper often goes back to its scary roots. The Reaper isn't shown directly in movies like Final Destination, but it's always felt as a hidden, crafty, unseen power that sets up complicated, dramatic events to get back anyone who cheats it. Playing on our fears, death is always waiting, and there's no way to get out of it. Here, death is an out-and-out predator rather than a guide or a negotiator. This reinforces the common fear of the unavoidable and gives life's unpredictability a supernatural edge. Comics have also given the Reaper new direction. In Marvel Comics, for example, Thanos is crazy about Lady Death, an ethereal entity like the Grim Reaper. She is not your usual ghost dressed in a robe in darkness, but rather strange and appealing, something desired, even attractive. She drives Thanos' actions so much so that he wipes out half of all living things from the face of the earth as proof of his love for Lady Death. The Sandman series by DC also presents Death as an unexpectedly friendly, even joyful, nearly happy young woman who wears casual clothes as a quirky charm. She is sensible, kind, and miles away from terrifying, although she is a figure of death but leads souls with kindness and patience. These depictions turn death into something cordial, even likable, sympathetic guide than a horrifying ghost. This image totally stands in stark contrast to the common fears we have of death and encourages us to see death as a friend instead of a threat. The Reaper is often shown in memes, cartoons, and satirical movies as a relatable, sometimes sarcastic figure who might complain about their job, joking about the character that we are all meant to be afraid of. You might be living under the rocks if you tell me that you haven't come across the meme where Grim Reaper is knocking on doors. Similarly, in the cartoon The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, the Reaper is portrayed as a typical but reluctantly amiable Jamaican accented character who spends a lot of time with two kids, which makes him very angry. As he laments his eternal duty, he becomes less of a terrifying character and more of a supernatural babysitter, which makes people giggle at the thought of death. Audiences can poke fun at death by laughing at the Grim Reaper. This helps to ease the pain of death and reminds us that even in the face of death, we can still keep up with our humor. With all of these different takes, the Grim Reaper has gone from being a scary creature to a cultural icon that is a part of our daily fantasies. While death is inevitable and kind of meh, who said the journey should be boring? Whether portrayed as a villain out there to reap souls with his cold, icy hands, a guide who just wants to ease our way to death, or even our source of amusement, the Reaper represents our changing view of death. By giving death a face, we transform the Grim Reaper into a reflection of our own fears, hopes, and finally, our acceptance that death is a part of life that we will all have to face. Marvelous verdict. So here we are at the end of the Grim Reaper story, or at least as much of it as we can pin down. From ancient gods who calmly guided souls to medieval nightmares that morphed into the black-cloaked figure with a scythe, the Reaper has worn many hats, or should we say robes, over the centuries. The Reaper has gone from being a silent guide or judge to a full-on cultural icon, both feared and oddly relatable, that shows up in movies, comics, and even jokes. We have gone from shuddering at the thought of death, but now we make jokes about it. Well, we certainly have come a long way. But hey, maybe that's the whole idea. The Grim Reaper isn't just a scary figure that lurks around to give us that last nudge towards the end. It reminds us that people have always tried to face death, shape it, and perhaps even chuckle at it. Therefore, the next time you come across a Reaper, not literally, obviously, but on a screen, meme, or books, think of it as an old friend who is there to tell you that even though death is inevitable, how we roll with it is all in our hands. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe out there. Thanks, everyone.